Thank you, Steve. I have no idea what an H factor of 42 is. And if it's to do with cholesterol, it sounds rather high. It's a really very kind and pleasant thing you're doing for me today and in the next 2 days when we have a seminar based on my stuff. It's a bit overwhelming, actually. So many people here from different bits of my life, and some people have travelled quite a way. I don't know if Lindy's actually come all the way from South Africa just for this. There's some, 4 people. I thought Doro from Budapest was going to get the prize, and beating the people from Italy and from the Netherlands who are here. But actually, I want to single out someone who also made a certain kind of sacrifice to be here. He's only come from Leamington Spa, and that's Robin Wensley, who had tickets for the Marat Sade play at Stratford this evening, and sacrificed them to come here. There's certain overlap in the themes, actually, certain points. But he was able to reduce the sacrifice, I'm very pleased to say, by the fact that the Shakespeare Theatre sent out a note to all those of us with tickets, which include my wife and myself. We did go. We're all right. Saying that people might want their money back because there were explicit sex scenes, some of them associated with religious imagery. And so Robin was able to claim his squeamishness on that grounds and therefore able to be with us today. So I had to point out that though there is a very small amount of sex in this lecture, towards the end, it's not at all explicit and it is not connected to religious imagery. But as I said, it's a very pleasant thing to have something like this done for you. It is sort of quite a high, especially coming after this little experience that I had last week with the University of Warwick. My son Ben, who's here, when Arsenal lose a match, he always says, well, if it wasn't for the lows, you wouldn't appreciate the highs. It's something he's had to say more often this season than usual. And I've had a little low, which makes me appreciate today's high. And I tell you, it's a funny story. And I'm going to use it as a link to the lecture in a highly artificial way. But when you leave a place, you've always got the odd student you're still supervising for bits and pieces. And I've got an MBA student I'm supervising for his dissertation. And they said, what happens to this poor man now you've gone? I said, okay, I just finished that off, right? And a nice lady in the MBA office said, well, we've got to pay you for this. I said, well, you don't really. But so she comes back with, she's got to go on the temporary payroll now, she says, and you've got to fill in this form, send it to me by email attachment. She says, unfortunately, Part B is very important. Part B is headed Prevention of Illegal Working and requires me to take my passport to an officer of the university who must then sign that he or she has seen it under threat of all sorts of penalties if they don't, and then send a photocopy of it to the university. And I said, this is silly. I worked here for nearly 7 years. And she went back to HR and said, look, this is silly. The fact that can't you transfer the information somehow that he'd worked here until 2 weeks previously onto this form? They said, no way. And it's a kind of typical, and I said, right, in that case, I'll do the work for no money. Huh. There you go. I'll teach you. And it's a confrontation between, on one hand, the forces of order grinding on as they do, meeting awkward, stubborn, bloody-mindedness. And the upshot of that is that I lose 100 quid. That's how you go. So that sort of relates. It's a slightly artificial link to the lecture, but I am talking about the encounter between, not so much the forces of order in a way, but pitted not so much against stubbornness actually as against sort of creative disruption. When I came into this business, shortly after I came into it, by the late 70s, there was a lot of talk about ungovernability. Philippe Schmitter is here, was part of the same discourse. A group of us got involved in this. That it was thought that the inflationary crisis of those days couldn't really be solved easily, that people even doubted that democracy was a safe place for capitalism to be, and that societies were becoming ungovernable. And well, they got to teach us how to behave. And for a while they were interested in the kinds of things that people like Philippe and myself were writing about, which was that you can shape institutions in a way that people's expression of democratic voice is actually rendered consistent with a strong economy and low inflation. And for a while the authorities would be interested in that, but they soon found something else, and they went off us. And what they found was something they called monetarism, which was whereby you put a stranglehold on the supply of money so that inflationary pressures in the economy would create unemployment, and that shut everybody up, and we became governable again. So basically the message was, shut up, work hard, and then you can go shopping, and that's it. But actually, by the late 80s, we didn't realise it until about 5 years ago, actually. They were actually saying something else. They were saying, shut up, work hard, go shopping. And if you can't afford the shopping, we'll lend you some money. Have a subprime mortgage, have credit card debt, anything so that you'll go shopping. And so actually what started off being tight control over money supply ended up being the extraordinary financial system that we experienced, we're still experiencing actually, which went into its crisis in 2008. And now as we roll through the aftermath of that, those same themes that we were talking about in the mid-70s are just returning to us. The Greek people want a couple of months to think about how they're going to accept this blow to their standard of living and their way of life. And that is unacceptable. Right? The markets can't tolerate that. The markets need to move much more quickly than that. They're making trades by the millisecond. You can't have a couple of months to decide something like that. And the question again is whether capitalism's happy with democracy. And democracy is okay as long as you don't use it much. And we're willing to fight wars, have people killed, our own soldiers killed, in order to fight for democracy for people. But once you've got it, you're meant to use it in a very orderly way. There's, in a way, a rather wider sense that, and it's a joke, but it's not. It's actually serious. We get rights on the condition we don't use them, and that's the compromise, right? Here, I can have some rights. Oh, thank you very much, sir. I won't use them. It's outrageous if a regime doesn't allow trade unions. How appalling! Not allowed free trade unions. But employers are under every incentive to try not to have them and not to recognise them, and they're seen as problematic. So you can have the right to have trade unions as long as you don't have trade unions. And so we're back in a world where there is an issue coming up again about how governable we all are. And this is an age-old thing, right? I mean, since the beginning of time, since the beginning of ordered society, there's been that issue of governability, order versus disruption. It takes a particular form in different periods, and the form it takes at the moment, primarily, is that there is a strong priority, not on order for the sake of it, as you get in dictatorial regimes, but order so that we can orchestrate all of our activities for economic competitiveness. And we must ensure that our education system, our skills system, almost everything we do is oriented to this goal of making a competitive economy. And this extends into a lot of things, because it's a particular model of competitive economy. It's one that prioritises the shareholder maximisation model of the corporation. Other models of the corporation, like mutuals, building societies, other things that didn't get in the way of speculation, were deemed to be not very efficient, not very effective. Within the field of public service, there's a strong stress on new public management, on stripping everything for the most efficient possible way of doing things. Government is increasingly carried on by groups of ministers, civil servants, and representatives of a small number of leading companies who are deemed to be very important for national competitiveness. So there's a kind of integration and focusing of life on a series of goals because of the very, very real challenge of globalization. And that's a very, very important aspect of our lives at the present time, and it's going to intensify very considerably, especially as we go through a few years of actual declining standard of living while we're still required to do all these things. against that is the continuing increasing unruliness of us all, in the sense that we don't easily obey. Modern populations are quite stroppy. I don't mean people riot on the streets. I mean that we ask why. Why should I do this? What are good reasons? We don't take orders kindly, and we make demands. And this is there's a kind of tension between these two forces. And I can't see the second one diminishing either. We're not going to go into a new age of deference. And we're kept online, we're kept in line mainly because they let us go shopping. And so, for example, even last year, this year, wasn't it? We had a royal wedding. We were told, well, it would be good for trade because people would buy souvenirs and things. Now we've been told, actually, the economy declined because of the royal wedding. Never mind. Now, I'm not saying that these two forces come together one day in some enormous clash and conflagration. It's not like that. That's not because it's not structured like that. What we get instead is a whole series of points across the world, across society, where this conflict is played out with different winners and losers and different patterns of alliances all over the place. But I think life will increasingly be full of that clash, of trying to orchestrate for some kind of common purpose a relatively unruly, difficult to govern population. In some ways, you can see this as the classical clash between right and left. And going back to the terms of the French Revolution, the right as established authority and the left as challenge to that authority. But the way I've described the opposition, it actually cuts quite across our existing concepts of left and right. Because that notion of orchestrating society around a few some certain strategic competitiveness goals, although the political centre-right adopt that, you can see it as a social democratic project. Because if you take the original neoliberal project is saying what we really need is markets, just create lots of markets. The opposition to that was saying, oh no, that's not good enough. Markets by themselves won't do it. We've got to ensure that there's infrastructure, we've got to ensure there's skills, we've got to ensure there's a mobilisation of a lot of different institutions, and that needs more than just making markets. So the project of the competitive state, the competitive society, is not a right-wing project alone by any means. It's a shared one. And also the challenge to that, the challenge, the kind of disorderly challenge that says why, and which wants to do other things, is by no means necessarily a left-wing project. I mean, there's a whole right-wing tradition of opposition to dragooning and opposition to being marshalled. So the conflict is endemic. It cuts right across a lot of things. And what is very important for the success of our societies is that this conflict is never resolved, but that it goes on. Because resolution by either one side or the other will be disastrous. Now, you can obviously you're told every day why it's necessary we have a competitive society and why we've got to orchestrate all our institutions around that. What we're not told so often is the attraction and the value of the other model, of the model of challenge, of resistance. And so what I want to do mainly this evening is to explore why constant challenge, disobedience, stroppiness are valuable. And that's not so difficult to do. But in particular, the hoop I've made for myself to jump through is to argue that paradoxically, we're more likely to achieve certain important major collective problems that we have in society, not so much the more we are orchestrated, but the more we're not, and the more that actually there is a possibility of dissidence and challenge. Now, part of the argument is simply about the joy and delight of not fitting into plans. But another part of it is actually a kind of subversive part that says actually it's in the end it's good for the system itself. to have this. And here I'm making use of a concept that was developed first by engineers, but which Wolfgang Streeck, I don't think he's here, I think he's coming tomorrow, Wolfgang Streeck has applied to the social world. That's the concept of redundant capacity. And that is the idea in engineering. You can't, when you're designing something like, say, an airliner, you can't simply design it for the everyday pressures that will normally be expected to bear. Because if something untoward happens, it's going to break up. Obviously, it would be much cheaper if you didn't have to do that, but you have to. And because engineers have to make calculations, they can't make aircraft absolutely airworthy. They have to make certain risk judgments, but they have to build in a large amount of redundant capacity. So there are rivets and bolts and bits in an aeroplane that normally do nothing for their living at all. Well, they never bear a strain in their whole life. And but the airplane's finally written off, you could say, well, we wasted our money on those, didn't we? We could have made that aircraft so much cheaper because it just had a little bit of turbulence. It didn't have to do with anything worse than that. But you can't do that because the risks are so bad. And so redundant capacity is something that can be seen as waste. But redundant capacity is also something that if you haven't got it, you can get into a lot of trouble. Or looking at it positively, and this is especially works when you move the idea into the social field, redundant capacity gives you the chance to use things you didn't know you needed at time one, but at time two, you find, oh my goodness, what a good job we've got that lying around. We never knew it would be of any use to us at all. So in a way, in arguing the case against the orchestrated society, I'm having my cake and eating it. On the one hand, I'm saying, yeah, what the hell, some of us just want to escape from orchestration. But then I'm saying, yeah, and actually, you might be grateful we did it one day. So if you say to me, right then, Crouch, when you do some research and you want to be left alone from being measured for its policy impact, are you saying that because you just want to get on with it with no one on your back? Or are you saying it because you believe you might come up with something in the long run more useful that way? My response is to say, I don't have to answer that question. All you need to know is it might be useful one day. Now, I'm trying to use this issue to say that actually there are certain collective challenges we face in the world that will be best tackled if we don't try and pin everything down and don't try and orchestrate everything, don't try and focus it. And this comes at a particular moment in history where we are facing some enormous collective challenges. And the challenges of the natural environment are probably not going to be met by our species before it's a bit too late. We don't know how to regulate the financial system unless we have a completely global system, but we have no capacity to meet a collective challenge of that size. And at the same time, we're living at a period where the one instrument that we thought we'd developed that helped us meet some collective challenges, but not enough of them, the state, is being denigrated, undermined, delegitimized, derived of revenues and staff. And so we are facing enormous collective challenges with very ill-equipped to do that, which is why I say we need to look beyond and around at wider things that don't fit the model. And in doing this, it's a paradox, right? That the less organized we are, the more we might be able to achieve collective goals. It's a paradox, but it's a paradox already built in to the word public. We use public in a number of senses, but with two primary senses. One, meaning the general public, meaning something's public, it means it's not owned by anyone, it's out there, right? An openness concept of public. The economists' concept of public goods as things that we don't compete for and we can't divide up, and they're sort of just out there. It's very much that idea. The public is something that you can't get hold of. But we also use public almost as a synonym for state, as an adjective. You can often go through a sentence and change state, where it's used adjectively, change state to public, and it doesn't affect the meaning. And that's very odd, because that's the very opposite, actually, of openness and extensiveness. And the origins of the word in the Latin verb statuo, meaning I establish, I set up. It has the same origins of the word statue. Right? It's something very fixed. And so that there's, in the concept of public, we have these two very different meanings. And it's interesting that in the other language group that's developed, because it's the Latin languages, including English for this purpose, that have a word like public or something similar to that. The Germanic language group, Dutch, German, Scandinavian languages, have a different word, but it captures the same ambiguity. And they have a word that derives from the word open, as in öffentlich in German, with the English word open is closely related, offentlich, depending on which language it is. And there again, it's the idea of that first meaning of public as open, extensive, unbounded. And at the same time, that's the word that you use as a synonym, a near synonym for state. So öffentlicher Dienst is public service. So it's interesting, those two language groups with different words, and the public comes out of a word for people, öffentlich comes out of a word for open. From those two very different concepts, both of them have been used with this double meaning. And I think it takes us into something quite profound about the ambiguity of the concept of public. And it's on that I think we can work and try and get something. What they do share, both senses of public, is neither of them is privately appropriated and turned into private property. When something is owned and turned into private property, it's not in the public in the sense of the state sphere, but at the same time it's also not publicly available. And we know that there's a great paradox of private property, that historically private property is the basis of rights. In the struggle against kings, it was the establishment of private property rights that kings couldn't invade, that gave aristocracy and the high bourgeois their rights. And a lot of our rights derive from that concept. I mean, the rights of Magna Carta are not actually the rights of ordinary people. They're the rights of the property rights of landowners, landholders. So at one point, the appropriation of something as private property conveys rights on the property owner, but by the same fact, it denies rights to everyone else within that ownership realm. Not thinking of property ownership in a trivial sense of just owning a house or a car, but property in the sense of owning substantial property that gives you rights to employ people or to make them slaves, depending on the system you're in, rights over people. Within an area of property ownership, the rights are concentrated in the owner, who then, as he or she wishes, might extend participation rights to other people in the system, but they might not. And we take it for granted that that monopoly of the right to communicate freely is what I'm talking about, really. I'm going to move on to some other similar public goods in a minute, but the right to communicate freely is something that is taken away, thanks, Cam, from most members of an organisation. So something that happens from time to time in this country is that a multi-billionaire from some part of the world acquires a football club. And, of course, immediately everyone says, well, it's his right to do what he likes with it. He's the owner. Maybe crazy, maybe what. He's the owner. Manager. The football wisdom of people in the club is completely trumped by that statement. He's the owner. He can do what he likes. Because ownership gives him rights and deprives other people of rights. That's true of it, but the thing about this is it's not only true, actually, of private ownership. Because although I said the state is part of the public zone, within the state and state-like structures like parties, as organisations, the same rule goes, that there is a concentration of communication power and the ability to give communication rights in the people at the top of the system. And they may or may not grant this. There's a very interesting article written by an old friend of Philippe and myself, Sandra Pizzorno, written in the early 90s about Italian politics at that time. And he distinguishes between what he calls politica coperta, politica palese, which is covered with secret politics and open politics. And he says that secret politics is where the real stuff goes on, right? It's the politics of a conversation of whispers among small elites who know what they're talking about together. And then the open discourse, the communication they address to the people or to lower members of their parties, is just a load of rhetoric. So the serious conversation goes on in tiny whispered groups. And of course, I'm adding this point now to it, subversive conversations go on in little whispered groups. And then there's the public performance, the communication that's given out to everybody else, which is often not very intelligent at all. And this, in a way, is characteristic of what happens when something like the right to communicate comes into organisational ownership. And given just a little example, a trivial example actually, but it makes the point. And that is that if you look at the kind of official literature or the house magazines of organisations, firms, universities even, they actually are very similar to the kind of literature that's produced in dictatorships. Lots of pictures of the Vice-Chancellor on every page. Everybody is happy and smiling. Can you imagine a university magazine that says a picture, members of the history department looking devastated when they're told they can't refill their posts. Some of you may know a very interesting book by a man called Alex Ross, the music correspondent of the New York Times, called The Rest Is Noise. It's about 20th century music. And he's got a section in there about music and the other arts under Hitler and Stalin. And how they always want happy music, happy art, happy faces, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed tunes and pictures. And everything's got to be like that, simple, nothing sad. And then he goes on to talk about the New Deal and F.D. Roosevelt, and how the New Deal had this big sort of project of state-sponsored arts, and Roosevelt goes around to visit an art exhibition in 1934 of New Deal art, and he quotes what he says as his comments on it. This is Roosevelt talking. He says, he was very pleased none of the paintings exhibited a despondent theme, and they avoided the decadence common to so much European art. And Ross comments, Stalin and Hitler would have agreed with these sentiments completely. The difference, of course, is that FDR lacked the means, the will, or the desire to enforce them. And that is the crucial point, that, yes, within an organisation, rulers and leaders want everything orchestrated by themselves, and the freedom to communicate is rather restricted. But the freedom to communicate, therefore, exists outside the scope of the organisations. And the difference between a capitalist society, a society with private property, and a society, either where you've got total state ownership, as in Stalin's Russia, or a kind of oligarchical elite that spreads across big business and the state, where you've got the private property, it's not the private property itself is the source of freedom, because it's only the source of freedom people who own it. But what happens is there are spaces open up between all the organisations, and it's in the spaces between these rather dictatorial structures that freedom happens, and freedom to communicate happens. And in a society where it's like that, the degree of dictatorship that you can get within any one organisation is much reduced. And the point I'm trying to get out of this is that the freedom to communicate as a collective value is possible because institutions can't control everything. It's something that exists interstitially. It's an interstitial thing. That the collective good of the right to communicate exists precisely because the institutions around us leave spaces. And if they don't leave those spaces, then we're in trouble. So the image I've got here is a kind of a street or set of streets in which there are some big buildings. Within the buildings, people talk in whispers, people on the top floor in important whispers. Downstairs they talk in just little whispers. And the people at the top have a megaphone with which they address the people downstairs and the people in the street. But the people in the street are talking freely. Unless they're in Syria, in which case a tank appears at the top of the street and kills them. These freedoms exist because of this sort of balance, but the freedoms exist outside the actual institutions themselves. And this is something that the freedom to communicate shares with a number of things. They will not be provided through property ownership or through the control of organizations, because those organizations will primarily look after the interests of those who control them. And so a quality like justice, which is a collective good, or increasingly nowadays we come back to the very literal meaning of these things that was there at the beginning of discussion and then disappeared in a very urbanized society, the natural environment. That private property doesn't protect the natural environment except to the extent that it's in the interests of property owners to do it. If it's anything to do with the natural environment that they can't use profitably, they're not going to look after it. And so we just look to contested spaces outside the scope of big institutions to raise collective concerns, to voice them, and to place them on the agenda of discussion and debate. But am I not writing off the role of the state too quickly? Actually, the solution to this problem that we found during the course of the 20th century or 19th and 20th centuries of having a state that looks after a lot of collective goals actually has worked quite well and continues to work quite well. Just to give a few little examples, just little local examples from this country. If you remember a few months ago, a big fuss when the government wanted to privatize the forests. Enormous furore over that. In the end, the Prime Minister had to pretend he didn't know the government had such a policy. So embarrassing was it to him. Now, what people were saying there was, we don't trust private property owners to look after the forests. We don't trust them to look after any collective interests in the forests. We actually prefer to trust the government that itself wants to get rid of the forests. We stand a better chance with them because whenever they do something, we can always make it an issue. Because, okay, there are owners and controllers of the controllers of states who are always trying to look after their own interests, but we've got a public domain where we can raise this as an issue. Also, ask the question, if you wanted to go for fair debate of issues, where you'd be guaranteed that all sides would be given a kind of crack of the whip, and where, on the whole, journalistic standards would be high, in this country, where would you go? Would you go to the BBC and the state-regulated private sector of broadcasting, or would you go to the popular press? Take a more precise example. We take the case of Italy, where Silvio Berlusconi owns an enormous media empire and lots of television stations, and also has enormous power over the state media. When it's Mediaset, when it's his own set of stations, he can do what he likes. He owns them, right? Like the football billionaire. He owns it. It's his. When he does it to RAI, to the National Broadcasting Institution, at least it's a scandal. At least there's a debate. At least it's seen as shocking, and there's some check. So the state, the democratic state, has managed to achieve a lot of things in getting attention to these collective goods in a way that private property can't. But what I want to avoid is that we then draw the conclusion, which I don't think anyone does draw anymore, that therefore if only we made the state bigger and bigger, it would do more and more of these things for us. Many of us, I include myself in this, believed that that was something that the Soviet Union had managed to do. Okay, we say they may have a rotten life, they haven't got any freedoms, but at least they look after collective goods. Right? They didn't. They didn't. The environmental abuse, the deterioration of public infrastructure, apart from a few prestige places like Prague, bits of East Berlin and Warsaw, it was completely neglected. Once the state gets so big, it doesn't actually look after collective goods at all. Communists have only looked after collective goods when they've been in office, where they've not been able to control an entire system, but just a part of it. So Bologna and other bits of central Italy, Kerala in southern India, there you'll get communists being good for public services and public goods. But where they had state monopoly, they wouldn't, because they were able to obliterate the interstitial spaces. There weren't any uncontrolled voices that could speak and could challenge the state's places. So again, I go back to the argument that whether it's private property or the role of the state, we depend for the voicing and the pressing of a whole series of collective issues on the spaces in between, on the uncontrolled, the unruly spaces. Also, there's another problem that the state has, and that which I've referred to already a bit, and that is that when we look at to the state as our collective actor, the state is bounded as a nation state. And we can't rise to these challenges that individual nation states can't deal with. But a world of nation states where the dialogue is primarily left to national political classes is one that prates of the importance of pursuing national interests all the time, and will only ever pursue wider interests if it can relate to national interests. So I come back again to looking to spaces outside the regulated, controlled world, the orchestrated world, for innovation, for voicing of concerns. Now, here we run into a problem in that a body of theory that many of us here have known about for nearly 50 years now. And that's the idea, what's called the problem of collective action. And that is that why would anyone join in any activity outside a kind of controlled institutional area where they're employed? Why would anyone want to do that when the contribution they can make to any cause is infinitesimally small, and when they're going to gain from its success whether they participate in it or not? And there's this problem. Why should anyone bother to raise big collective issues? Why would they want to do that? And this is primarily a problem for economics because of its model of actors as motivated by very immediate exchanges of price for value. So it's not at all a problem for the economic explanation of human behaviour that people would want to buy food products that make them fat, give them heart disease and possibly give them cancers. Because they go into a shop and they buy it. End of story, right? There's a market for it. There's a market for junk food. So there isn't a problem. Why do people do that? Because it's on sale, people buy it. That's it, end of story. If they don't want it, they don't buy it. But we know from outside the world of economics that actually people do a large number of things and are motivated by a whole lot of forces that can't be reduced, can't be reduced to a cash nexus, but they can't be reduced to a calculation of obvious interests. There are other human motivations than things that actually give us any gain. And this is where I warn Robin, this is where the bit of sex comes in now. See? If you give a list of certain, I pluck a list of just 6 people I thought of, but you can see what they've all got in common. They've got it in common with millions of other people. Mark Antony, Cleopatra, Henry VIII, Catherine the Great, Bill Clinton, Dominique Strauss-Kahn. All highly ambitious people, all really savvy, smart, ruling type people, but all had something else that really motivated them, which in the case of 3 of them, Mark Antony, Cleopatra and Dominique Strauss-Kahn, had rather negative implications for their careers. The other 3 got away with it. They all had, there's that wonderful song in the Thrupney opera, the Ballad von Sexueller Hörigkeit, the ballad of sexual enslavement, in a way, which starts off, you've all heard of Solomon and what became of him. And it's the song about the power of sexual motivation to drive people, sometimes against what look like all of their interests. Now, if we can understand why people are willing to buy junk food, if we can understand why people junk their careers for sexual satisfaction, can't we also understand that people fight for a whole load of other things? And because the empirical evidence around us is that they do. That an enormous number of people commit themselves to a whole load of causes that don't actually have any immediate payoff for them, and which make them a damn nuisance to the system, but which they pursue and work for. And I might be naive in believing this, but it seems to me that we stand a better chance of facing up to some of the big collective challenges that we have, the more space that's open just for that to be allowed to come out. It's part of redundant capacity. Not everything that comes out in a society of freedom is going to produce something positive. A lot of it would be negative, a lot of it would be just neutral, just a lot of rubbish. But if there's enough going on, if there's enough space free from the institutions, if there's enough space left free from articulation and orchestration around major national tasks, then some of it in there will be of this kind. And we have, immediately one thinks of protest movements and campaigns, especially perhaps at the present time, and I do have those in mind, very much so, but not only them. One might think people bothering to reinvent mutual forms of capital ownership rather than shareholder maximisation would be an example. Those climate change scientists who worked away with no corporate funding, of course, very little reward, gradually, painstakingly laying bare to us what we were doing to the planet. Those scientists in particular in East Anglia University, totally unjustly vilified, their lives made hell for months and months until they were exonerated of the charges the climate change skeptics put against them, and yet battling on, carrying on. Food scientists who refuse the blandishments of corporate funding in order to get at what's in the stuff we're eating and what it does to us. Whistleblowers in firms like Enron, whistleblowers who very rarely actually get a reward. Most whistleblowers end up unable ever to work again in the career they've trained for, because if you whistleblow on one organisation, you might do it to another. People do it. People take these risks. Another one these have been easy cases for me. One now that I have trouble with this one, but I think it's there. Tax-dodging philanthropists. Someone like Bono doesn't pay any taxes to the Republic of Ireland. The Republic of Ireland would be nothing like the mess it's in if he paid his taxes. But he's done things with that money, and he may well say, look, if I paid my taxes, they'd just use that to fuel more debt, actually. It would have been way, or on some of these absurd building projects that were going on in Ireland. I've actually been able to use that money to draw attention to some huge collective problems the world's got and to get people to talk about them. Is it not better he dodges his taxes, manages, well, tax avoidance, not evasion, I suppose, and actually does that? One that I'm happier talking about, I managed to swallow that one, actually, notice, in the end, is, and this comes very close to home now, is how we see education. Because education is very much at the heart of the debate and the struggle over whether things should be orchestrated for a purpose or left free. Because you can, in fact, it's got all of my ideas in it. And this isn't because I framed the talk round it. It's because I realised it at a late stage. You can set about having education for two different reasons. You can say education is good to have because it opens up a whole lot of worlds to you. Once you've got an education, you can talk about certain things, you can enjoy certain things, so you can understand science, you can understand music and art, you can read difficult books, you can see what mathematics is about, you can do all these things which actually extend what you can do as a human being. Full stop, end of story. That's all you need to justify it. And furthermore, the more people who've got that, the more people you've got to talk to about it, and also the more things that are going to be provided for people like you who've got education. So education can be seen as something that is just there for you to enjoy. And that's totally non-rival, I mean, in the economist sense. We don't have to compete with each other for that. My education doesn't, in a way, compete with yours in any way. In fact, the fact that we both have it helps us both. Then there's the view of education which fits into the model of national competitiveness. And that says it's very important we have a lot of education, right? So both positions start from that. Important we have a lot of education, and this must be purposive education. It must be designed to get people into jobs that we need in the economy. And there's something interesting that contributes to that the last government started and the present one has continued, that universities ought to be publishing information about the earnings of their graduates after X years. And young people should be looking at that at age 17, right? It's not whether I'm going to enjoy doing it, it's how much they're going to be worth 10 years later. Now these are the two models, you see, and then come back to the first one, the one where you just have it and you just do it. It's there for two purposes. It's there because it's in itself it's enjoyable and pleasant, but there might be redundant capacities in it. Because that ability to get knowledge that at the point in time is of no use to anybody except that you love it and want to enjoy it, might one day actually be of use somewhere, and you have to, and that's where my argument in favour of dissidence and unruliness is able to come back and kick the orderly in the tail and say, you might one day need us. So, some of you will know Alan Bennett's play, The History Boys, which is a play about exactly this. And there are two principal school teachers in it. One who trains the boys to pass the examinations to get into Oxford. Very, very targeted, very focused education. And then the other is an impossible character who, his lessons are just a chaos. Sometimes they're singing a bit of American musicals. Sometimes they're talking about films. All sorts of things go on. Actually, both the characters, for different reasons, are quite scurrilous characters. But the point is the second one, obviously they fit my two models, right? Absolutely perfectly. But it's very interesting what Hector, the teacher who lets them do everything, the old chap, he comes back at the end after he's died, and he says, he likens the education he's been giving them to a pass the parcel game. He says, pass the parcel. That's sometimes all you can do. Take it, feel it, pass it on. It's not for me, it's not for you, it's for someone, somewhere, one day. Pass it on, boys. That's the game I want you to learn. Pass it on. Now, although he's appeared throughout the play as a apostle of a kind of education that is just there for fun and enjoyment, he's actually there outlining the theory of redundant capacity. Right? I don't know if Alan Bennett's heard of the theory of redundant capacity. Right. It's not for me, it's not for you, but it's for someone, somewhere, one day. Right. So it is meant to be useful, it's just that you don't know it. Now, when you design redundant capacity into engineering systems, or some social situations, you can design it in consciously and deliberately. So, for example, advertising agencies have creative staff who aren't expected to behave as account executives are. They're allowed to dress differently. Their lives are different because they're creative. They come up with ideas sometimes and sometimes they don't. You can't require them to come up with ideas on so many days of the week. Pharmaceutical companies have staff sometimes who are turning ideas into actual medicines, and they're under certain constraints about what they've got to deliver. But they also, if they're real research intensive firms, they have to have some scientists who are quite free and who can't be required to come up with something every so often. They've got to be given longer time lags because you can't predict when a really new idea is going to come up. Research in universities is the same. You can't do it to order, so you have to accept a certain amount of waste, and that has to be designed into the system. But in all of those examples, and in the engineering cases, it's designed into the system by people who decide how much redundant capacity they can afford before it gets just too expensive and nothing's coming out of it. In society at large, no one controls it, thank goodness. And so redundant capacity is just something that's out there. You can't turn it, you can't decide how much you want. You can't decide whether the institutions you've got are good ones for getting it. No one's in a position to do that. All we can do is allow a lot of free-floating initiative to happen, not to harness everything, not to try and get everything organised around national competitiveness, and possibly sometimes there'll be a redundant capacity, and even if that doesn't work, at least people will enjoy themselves. Thank you very much.